Before I forget. Okay, I think it's recording. Great. This is the fourth webinar in our series on climate change in North Carolina that's being co-hosted by my office, the State Climate Office of North Carolina, and the North Carolina Institute for Climate Studies, or NCICS. And we just have a little bit of information on the slide here. If you've been to any of our webinars so far, you've probably seen this slide lots of times, but we really wanted to, again, just emphasize that both of our organizations are really excited to be putting on this series. We both focus a lot on understanding and researching climate in North Carolina, and we try to collaborate on a lot of things. One of those recent collaborations was the North Carolina Climate Science Report, which NCICS led and the State Climate Office contributed to, along with many, many other organizations and researchers in the state. So we're excited that everyone's here today. Just a little bit of Zoom information during the webinar today while speakers are going. If you can, just please keep yourself muted. Please also turn off your video. We've had a couple of people just say that it can be distracting to see people kind of moving while somebody's talking. So if you can, just turn off your video. I might send you a little message to nudge you if you haven't. And then once we get to the discussion portion, please feel free to turn that video back on. Throughout the webinar, if you have any questions for the speakers, please feel free to make use of that chat feature like you did in the icebreaker and just type a question there. We're going to hold questions until the end, unless it's just like a quick clarification question. And then we'll address them at the end of the talks in sort of a more of a panel Q&A type session. Great. So we have three talks today. We're going to hear from Corey Davis first, giving us kind of a science background, focusing on the history and the future of drought and wildfires in North Carolina. And then we'll have Dr. Adam Taranto and Laurel Kays talk about some of the other sort of aspects and research and future directions and communication with drought and wildfires in the state. And so I'm going to hand it over to Corey. Corey, if you want to go ahead and start sharing your screen, you should be able to just take it from me. Corey is an applied climatologist with the State Climate Office of North Carolina. Oops, my screen just hid my notes for my introduction for you, Corey. I'm sorry. So Corey's work helps include monitoring drought in North Carolina. He's done a number of research projects and developing online tools for fire weather, and he regularly provides climate communications and outreach. And he's actually been working in the field of fire weather for the past 9 years. So I'm really excited that he agreed to speak today about wildfires and drought in the state. So Corey, I'll take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. I was also really excited to get the invitation to speak and talk a little bit about the science of drought and wildfire, and also how some of these events have looked in the past and present in North Carolina, and what we can expect in the future. So I want to start off by telling a story, and it's probably one that you've heard before, but we'll talk about it in a little bit different context. In the mid-1580s, so more than 400 years ago, Sir Walter Raleigh commissioned an expedition across the Atlantic to try to set up a colony in the United States. So this group of a little over 100 people landed in eastern North Carolina on what we now know as Roanoke Island. And they had some good accomplishments while they were there. For instance, the first English child born in the New World, Virginia Dare, was born in that colony. But after that, we don't know a lot about what happened to them, and that's why they became known as the Lost Colony. A trip in 1590, a few years later, that came to try to find that colony didn't have any luck. They couldn't see where they were at. The only real evidence that was left behind was this carving in a tree that said Croatan, which was the name of one of the Native American tribes, and also the former name of Hatteras Island. So for a long time, we haven't really known what's happened to the lost colony. Some researchers have speculated that maybe the colonists came into a disagreement or a fight with the Native Americans. There's also been more recent ideas that said maybe they learned to coexist with the Native Americans. They just moved further down the coast. But there actually is another tree in eastern North Carolina that may tell us at least what the conditions were like for the lost colony there. So researchers have come through and found some very old trees that have been there for hundreds of years. And by taking a segment of those trees and looking at the tree rings, they can tell how wet or dry each growing season was in that part of the state. And what they found in their tree ring data that they analyzed going back more than 800 years is that the 3-year period right after the lost colony arrived, from 1587 to 1589, was the driest 3 years in that entire 800-year sample. So again, we don't know if maybe that led them to starvation or other problems, but we do know that drought was something that they were likely dealing with here in North Carolina when they had first come to our state. So that just goes to say that drought has a long history and is sort of interwoven with the story of North Carolina's modern history. But one thing when we think about a climate perspective is that we're actually fairly drought resilient and drought resistant in North Carolina, and that's because of our geography. We have two pretty large, warm bodies of water not too far away, the Gulf of Mexico to our south and southwest, and then the Atlantic Ocean to our south and southeast. And as weather systems move over these large bodies of water, they pick up moisture and deposit it as precipitation in North Carolina. So this can be things like cold fronts that are carried along by the jet stream. If the jet stream dives far enough south, these systems can move over the Gulf of Mexico and pick up that moisture and bring it, especially from the fall through the spring. We know in the wintertime, we often see low pressure systems that form either over the Gulf or to our south over the warm waters in the Atlantic. They're also bringing in that moisture, and this is where we see most of our winter storms or then nor'easter type events, where we also see pretty good precipitation in some of those. And of course, like we know from just this year, we can have tropical storms and hurricanes that move across the Atlantic and even come in from the Gulf of Mexico. And those are responsible for a good chunk of our rainfall. So North Carolina does have a pretty moist and a pretty humid climate, especially when we compare to the other side of the country. We have the desert Southwest pretty much at the same latitude as we're at. It's very dry. They don't tend to get that much rainfall. So again, in a sense, we're lucky because drought and dry weather is really not as important of a role in our climate as, say, it is out west. But with that said, droughts can still happen. So why do they happen? Well, usually it's when high pressure forms and sits over us for days or weeks or even months at a time, especially during the summer, which is our hottest time of the year, when rainfall can be a little more sporadic. So off to our east, we have this high pressure system you'll hear sometimes called the Bermuda High. If it slides a little bit closer to the East Coast, it can sit over the eastern United States and North Carolina. This is sometimes called a dome of high pressure, and basically that dome just shields us from any weather systems that might bring in rainfall from the south or from the west. When we have the Bermuda High sitting over us like this, the winds around that high are coming in from the south or the southwest, so that is a pretty warm and moist feed of air. This is when we get those really sticky and humid summer days. And there's at least enough moisture there that you can often see pop up just afternoon showers and thunderstorms. But those tend to be fairly localized. So it's not unusual during the summer for some parts of the state to miss out on rain for a few weeks at a time, and they can slip into drought conditions in those areas. The high pressure that's really more worrisome is when it comes in from the west, because this is high pressure that's sat over the desert Southwest, just getting hotter and even drier. And as it slides eastward and then moves over North Carolina, we'll get that feed of very hot, very dry air coming in from the west. And under this pattern, again, it's even drier. We don't even see those afternoon pop-up showers and storms because there's not a lot of moisture that this high is bringing in. And this is also when we tend to see some of our most extreme heat waves. So we can have highs getting up above 95 or 100 degrees during these summer spells like this. So along with being very uncomfortable, it can also lead to pretty rapid drought formation that we'll talk about a little bit later. One note I wanted to make before we go on is that measuring and monitoring drought is really not as easy as you might think. You know, we think about drought as being pretty closely related to precipitation, but even looking at a precipitation amount or a precipitation deficit often doesn't tell you the whole story. For instance, if over a year Asheville gets 40 inches of rain, well, that's actually a couple inches above their normal annual rainfall. But if Wilmington gets 40 inches, well, they average about 60. So that would be a pretty bad drought, most likely in the Wilmington area with the same rain amount. Also, we know if you're an inch below normal in January, that'll have very different impacts than being an inch below normal in July, which sort of leads to the second point in that we usually measure and monitor drought based on those impacts that they have. And we know that those impacts can really differ and vary from one drought to another. And we've seen that in the last few years. So I wanted to highlight a few different recent droughts that we've had in parts of the state. First, going back to 2015, this is in the Charlotte area. In the middle of the summer there, the hottest part of the year. They went a couple months with below normal rainfall and also pretty warm temperatures. So during that time, the main stress they saw was on water supplies. A lot of the reservoirs were just struggling to meet the demand, again, during that hot time of the year. So we started to see water levels running low, water restrictions were implemented. But even though there were some impacts to agriculture, it wasn't as significant as what they had with water supplies. The very next year, we had a drought going into the fall. And by that time, a lot of the crops had already been harvested, so ag wasn't hit that bad. Water supplies were being drawn down to their winter levels. So again, water supplies weren't hit that hard, but instead it was forestry this year because we were entering the fall fire season as things were drying out even worse. And we saw some pretty bad wildfires in the mountains in 2016. And then just last year, late in the summer, early in the fall, we had a pretty severe drought in the Western Piedmont. And during that time, this is going into the harvest period, right when crops were reaching maturity. They got hit by this awful dry weather and some very hot weather. And a lot of those crops just dried up in the fields. So as a result, ag was hit hardest by the flash drought last year, whereas forestry and water supplies really weren't hit that bad. They had a wet spring leading into that dry period. So water supplies were in pretty good shape. And again, it wasn't right during that peak fall fire season. So with all that said about monitoring and measuring drought, there are some different indicators we can look at that have been devised to help us compare between different time periods historically. One of the most common ones is this Palmer Drought Severity Index. This just takes into account a combination of precipitation, which gives a sense of the incoming moisture, and then temperatures, which gives a sense of evaporation or the outgoing moisture. And when we look at this PDSI since 1900, we can see there have been a lot of wet periods in North Carolina and also some pretty big dry ones. And if you go through and count the sort of severe multi-year droughts, there's at least 8 or 9 in this 120-year period. So again, drought is an important and recurring part of our climate in North Carolina. So we don't have time to talk about each one of these events today, but I did want to focus on just 2 or 3 main ones and talk about how things have changed, how things haven't changed over time. We'll start off by going back almost 100 years to the mid-1920s. I think this is an interesting event because in American history, we hear about the Dust Bowl era across the Midwest in the 1930s. But 10 years before that, we had our own pretty bad drought in North Carolina. This one started during a pretty dry summer in 1925, and that dry weather just carried on for almost 2 years. So the map on the right here shows another drought index, the Standardized Precipitation Index, which basically just puts the amount of rain you've had over a given time period in a historical context. And that tells us over this 2-year period from 1925 to 1927, we were extremely dry across most of North and South Carolina, one of the least amount of precipitation we've ever had over a 2-year period in the state. So along with the obvious impacts that farmers would have faced during this event, just not having crops be as productive, there were other political and societal things going on then too. After World War I, the federal government ended price supports for a lot of crops that were grown in the US, and European farms started coming back online after the war. So a lot of our historical cash crops like tobacco and cotton just weren't getting the same amount of money at market that they once did. And again, our farms in the Carolinas just weren't as productive during these events. We were also seeing issues with new pests, things like boll weevils that were coming into the Carolinas, and that was causing problems for farmers. So as a result, we were seeing tens of thousands of farms either abandoned or foreclosed on during this drought event, not to mention that we were having rivers and stream levels run low because we had such an extended period of dry weather. So again, that was one of the oldest, but also one of the most severe droughts in our modern record in North Carolina. We'll fast forward now to a more recent event and one that I'm sure probably more people remember, which was from 2007 to 2009. The image like you see on the left here was common across the state during this event. This is Falls Lake in Raleigh, and where it's usually very full. Instead, it was just a stream of water that was running through the middle because we did have such a prolonged period of hot and dry weather. This drought event actually started in the late winter and early spring when we didn't get as much rainfall recharge as we expected during the wintertime, and it continued into a pretty warm spring. With that said, farmers also had to deal with a very late spring freeze event, the Easter freeze in 2007. So they lost a lot of their early planted crops then. And then after that, we went into a hot, dry summer. They lost even more of their crops after that. So by the time we got to December of 2007, again, this wasn't even halfway through the drought for a good chunk of the state. We were already classified in exceptional drought on the US Drought Monitor map, by far the most severe category that they have on the drought monitor. And we were seeing some really worrisome impacts. Again, just in 2007 alone, not even covering this full multi-year drought event, the losses for the agriculture sector in North Carolina were more than $500 million. Water supplies, again, were hit hard as well. At one point, Durham's main reservoir had only 38 days left of supplies. So again, running really, really scarily low in some of our major reservoirs across the state. The final event I'll talk about really barely even shows up on the graph at the top because it was fairly short-lived and it was never really all that severe, at least on that drought index, the PDSI, but we know there were some pretty bad impacts from it in parts of the state. And this is the flash drought that we had last year. So flash drought is a term you may have heard before. It basically just refers to a drought that emerges more quickly than normal. Instead of taking several months for that drought to emerge like we saw in 2007, these can often emerge just over the span of weeks. Usually when you have very hot, very dry weather, for instance, if we have one of those high pressure systems from the western US move over us, and again, just rob us of any of that rainfall that we might normally see. And that's exactly what we saw across the western Piedmont late last summer and early last fall. The graph here shows conditions from Statesville. And what we saw going back earlier in the summer is that we had had some warm weather. We had had high temperatures, which you see in the orange line here, that were pretty regularly getting up in the upper 80s and low 90s. But that was also supplemented by pretty regular rainfall that you see in the blue bars at the bottom. At least that is until we got to the end of September of last year, or the end of August and early September. At that point, again, one of those high pressure systems from the west moved over. They went basically the entire month of September all the way through mid-October without seeing barely any rainfall in the western Piedmont. And they kept seeing that hot weather. By early October of last year, we had some of the hottest days of the year up in the mid 90s. So again, very hot, very dry. And as a result, we saw the very rapid introduction of drought conditions across much of the mountains in the Piedmont. Again, just a little over a month it took, going from only sparse, abnormally dry conditions to having pretty widespread drought. And one of the impacts we saw was just how soil moisture got depleted so quickly. Most places were in pretty good shape coming into September. By the end of or middle of October, we had pretty widespread shortages in topsoil moisture. And I think one of the really scary things about this flash drought and other events like this is that it happened without much warning. A lot of the weather forecasts and outlooks, even in early September, were showing the next month likely to be pretty dry or be pretty hot, but not really any indicators of dry weather to come. And again, just for the fact that it was so dry, they saw hardly any rain at all, was really unpredicted and unforeseen. So now thinking about, again, going back to the 1920s drought, what's changed since then? What have we done across the state to better adapt to drought and make us better able to deal with drought events? One of the big changes is the construction of man-made reservoirs for water supply. This began basically back after that 1920s drought. We had federal agencies like the Tennessee Valley Authority that were building these reservoirs in the western part of the state, and groups like the Army Corps of Engineers that were building them across the Piedmont. These were intended for flood control, but they've also been useful for storing water supply in the event of droughts. So again, that gives us a little bit better capacity to handle these droughts. At the same time, we are a fast-growing state and have been for the past 100 years or more. In the mid-1920s, North Carolina's population was sitting at right around 3 million. Today, we're over 10 million, so the population has more than tripled. So while we're able to have more capacity to store water, for instance, for water supply, the demands have also greatly increased over that time. And that's why even in some of these recent droughts we've had, a lot of times water restrictions are still necessary. And that impacts agriculture as well, of course. On farms with irrigation, they may have to cut back on that during these drought events if there's just not enough supply available. We know we're also encountering new climate pressures. So over the next few slides, I want to show some images and stats from the North Carolina Climate Science Report. Like Rebecca mentioned at the start today, we've had other webinars in this series that have talked about the climate science report in more detail. So I'll point you to those if you want some of the background information. But I did want to share what some of the findings show that are relevant for drought in North Carolina. First, let's talk about just how our annual rainfall and precipitation may change. The map that you see on the left here is showing over the next 20 years. And then the map in the middle and on the right are showing over the next 20 years in the middle of the century. And this is broken into two different scenarios. One in the middle assumes that we may have a cutback on our emissions, and some of the changes that we're seeing because of these man-made greenhouse gas emissions may slow. The map on the right assumes that there is no change in emissions, that we stay on our current pathway. And again, really no big changes there. And what we see is that in terms of annual precipitation, we're likely to be a little bit wetter over the next 20 years than we have been. Over the next 20 years, probably a little bit wetter still. In fact, some parts of the state could see a 3 to 6% increase in their annual average rainfall. So if you're getting 50 inches of rain a year, you might see another 2 or 3 inches of rain on average per year. And you might look at that and say, hey, that sounds great. You know, more rain means less drought. But this one set of maps doesn't tell the full story. The way our rain falls is also changing. So we can look at something like extreme precipitation events, when you get at least 3 inches of rain falling in a given day. We're already seeing these changes historically. These events are trending upward. It used to be where we would see maybe not even one day per year with at least this much rainfall. But over the last 4 years that this study analyzed, from 2015 to 2018, we had the most number of extreme precipitation events in that period of any other since 1900. And again, we know there is variability here, but also we are seeing this steady increase over time. And this just goes back to some of the basic physics of the atmosphere that scientists have known for hundreds of years. And that's that as the air warms up, its ability to hold water vapor is also increasing. So it makes sense that as the air warms, we have better capacity to support these really intense rainfall events. And when we look at the climate projections, they also show this likely increasing over the next 20 years and also by mid-century. In fact, some parts of North Carolina could basically see it doubling in their number of extreme precipitation events, again, by the middle of the century. So what does that mean? Well, if you're seeing more rain falling in fewer events, that means you may have more frequent and more intense dry periods in between rains. So because of this, we actually think that some types of drought events like these flash droughts may become more common going forward, again, even over the next 20 to 40 years. We can also look at some other climate indicators like the hottest days per year. Again, when it gets above 95 degrees, that's usually because we have one of these really warm high pressure systems that's moved in. Historically, these have been pretty rare. We may only see, for instance, like a dozen days per year getting this hot across the sandhills or the southern coastal plain. Well, in the future, it looks like that will become pretty commonplace to maybe have 20 to 30 days per year across most of the Piedmont and the coast by the middle of the century under some scenarios. So again, the number of hot days is increasing, and that means that overall evapotranspiration will be increasing as well when we have such hot weather. Another indicator is looking at warm nights. So when the temperature never drops below 75 degrees, again, this is also on the increase. And we're seeing this especially in parts of southern and eastern North Carolina, in some of our developing urban areas, where historically we may only see a handful of these days per year. In the future, we could see 20 to 30 such days per year. So this is also important, especially for agriculture. Crops need cooler temperatures overnight to recover during the summertime. If it never drops below 75, they just don't get that opportunity for nighttime recovery, which increases that plant heat stress overall. So just to summarize some of these climate pressures, again, we do see that our climate is likely to become warmer or wetter in the future, but it's also changing how our precipitation falls, where we'll see heavier rain falling in fewer events. And you can think about the impacts of that. For one, if 3 inches of rain falls in a day, not all of that rain will be absorbed by the soil. More of that will run off or pond up and eventually evaporate without benefiting the soils and the crops. And also, again, if more of our rain is packed into fewer events, that means we'll have longer dry spells and more frequent dry spells between events. Combined with the warmer temperatures we expect to see and that we're already seeing, that means events like those flash droughts we had last year are likely to become more common, again, combining that really rapid drying of soils and loss of moisture to evapotranspiration, along with things like the overnight plant heat stress due to those warmer minimum temperatures. The Climate Science Report has a couple paragraphs that specifically talk about droughts and what's likely to happen in North Carolina. First, they note that some research studies have looked at how large-scale patterns may change, and they look at something like the Bermuda high pressure system and see that it's likely to be closer to the North Carolina coast, shifting further to the north and northwest in the future. So again, we know what type of weather that brings in the summer, pretty sticky, muggy weather, but also more limited rain events, just those pop-up showers and storms. They also note that it's likely that future droughts will be more severe based on, again, increasing the soil moisture deficits and how they impact agriculture that's fed by rain and also natural vegetation. So again, these are all things that we're expecting to see based on the best available science that we have. So I want to move on now to a related topic, which is wildfire. And before I go on, I want to say a big thanks to Dr. Joseph Royce. He's a professor in the Department of Forestry at NC State, and I was able to talk with him virtually a couple weeks ago. He provided a lot of the information and background about fire and forest management in North Carolina that I'm able to share with you today. So again, that was a big help, being able to talk to him and pick his brain a little bit. So just to start off with, let's talk about why wildfires happen. And when we think about big wildfires, you probably think about the Western United States. So when we look at a place like Sacramento, California, and just look at their annual average temperatures and rainfall by month, you can see that, of course, they do see their warmest weather in the middle of the summer, but also they see very dry weather that time of the year. In fact, between April and October, they see most months average less than an inch of rainfall. So again, you're going basically half the year with very, very little rainfall. So when fires start in those areas, they can get pretty big pretty quickly. And what really stands out to me about this picture is not the fire that's burning in the background, but it's the vegetation in the foreground. These are all what we call fuels, things that burn, and none of it's green. It's all very, very dry. And you can imagine that if a fire rolls through this area, that's going to light on fire very quickly with no resistance. So again, it's no wonder that you see such large fires spreading, because when they're not getting that rainfall rejuvenation during the summer, things dry out in a hurry. So we can compare the climate of Northern California with the climate of North Carolina. And the biggest difference you see here is that we don't have a distinct wet and dry season in North Carolina. We tend to average about even amounts of precipitation just about every month of the year. And again, that's thanks to our two big bodies of water that we have nearby that tend to keep us pretty moisture recharged just about year round. With that said, there are a couple times of the year when we do usually see more fire activity, and those are in the spring and in the fall. So why does this happen? Well, when you think about what the landscape looks like in the spring, before the leaves have emerged on the trees and you've had widespread green up, you've still got a lot of leafless trees. That's basically just exposed woody biomass that can burn if a fire goes through an area. Also, before the leaves come out, there's lots of area between the branches that the sun can shine through, and we are warming up this time of the year. It's not unusual to have some warm temperatures in March and April. So as the sun hits those areas on the ground, it can dry out things like, say, mulch or leftover leaves from the previous year pretty quickly. A lot of the grasses haven't greened up yet either early in the spring, so they can dry out as well. So if we have something like a cold front come through without a lot of rainfall, it may drop humidities behind it. It may pick up the winds behind it. And if a fire starts, whether it's from a lightning strike or human activity, then that can cause a fire to begin and spread pretty quickly. The same thing basically happens in reverse in the fall, and that's that once the trees lose their leaves, those leaves are sitting on the ground, they're all dead, they're all dry, and again, as the sun hits those, they can dry up even more, and if you were to have a fire come through an area, they can spread pretty quickly during this time of the year. I should also note that we have historical evidence that fire has been a part of North Carolina for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Researchers have gone into parts of the mountains and dug up a soil sample like this, and in there they found bits of charcoal. And when you look at those under a microscope, you can actually identify the species of tree that burns. So we know what the historical forest landscape looked like, again, hundreds or thousands of years ago. And they can also attempt to date when these fires happened. And because of that, again, we know we have had fire for hundreds or thousands of years historically. More recently, we do have a little bit better statistics from the North Carolina Forest Service that they've collected since the 1920s. First, just looking at the number of wildfires per year, it's tempting to look at this graph and think that we've had an increasing trend, but I would caution that in some of these earlier decades, they may not have had as thorough documentation of especially the smaller fires. Beginning in the 1970s, the documentation's been a little bit better, and we really don't see much of a trend since then. I think the more telling graph is this one that shows the acres burned per year, and that shows a big spike in wildfire acreage back in the 1940s and 50s. Even in the mid 1980s, we had another multi-year drought event then, and we were seeing more than 100,000 acres burned by wildfires per year. Ever since then, that acreage has been much lower, even during our multi-year drought events. And that has actually a lot to do with the way that forests have been managed and how our forest management practices have changed in North Carolina. So again, going back hundreds of years ago, we know that controlled burning is something that's happened. For instance, when a lot of the European settlers came over, they noticed that the Native American tribes were burning their crops after the growing season ended, just setting fire to whatever stems and stalks were left in the fields. And that added a lot of nutrients back into the fields that would help next year's crop. Also, a lot of those settlers came from places like Scotland and Ireland, where the landscape may be a little bit more open than it is here. So they would practice woods burning, just to burn down an area of land so that they could use it for agriculture or to graze their livestock. So again, we know that they've seen benefits in doing burning like this since these colonial times happened. But we had a big change in forest management in the late 1800s. The timber industry became big, so they went through large plots of land that they owned across the state and in fact across the entire Southeast, and would clear cut these forests down, basically just left nothing behind. And that changed what we call the fire or fuel structure in these areas. So instead of having a lot of the older and larger trees still left, you were seeing lots of new vegetation come up. This is vegetation that could dry out very quickly. It was very low to the ground. So if you did see a fire start in these areas, it was likely to burn through pretty rapidly. So for that reason, especially the federal U.S. Forest Service decided by the early 1900s that we probably needed to stop having any fire activity just to let some of the forests regenerate and to avoid what could be some really bad wildfires if they started. So by the 1920s and 1930s, you had this burning question, pun intended, come up, and that's whether there were benefits to having regular prescribed fire. Again, farmers and landowners across the state had been doing this for hundreds of years, so of course they knew that there were benefits to that. But again, the U.S. Forest Service was worried about what could happen if fire started, so they said no. That's when the Smokey the Bear campaign started to prevent forest fires, and it's really only been in recent years where this has changed to only you can prevent wildfires. And basically between the 1930s and the 1960s, there was next to no prescribed burning, especially on federal land in North Carolina. But we did start to see changing attitudes when we had some of these multi-year drought events in the 1940s and 50s. And during those times, we saw exactly what they feared. These large areas of forest that had regrown pretty much unchecked just burned up. The picture you see on the right is from the Lake Phelps fire in 1955. By all accounts, that's probably one of the largest wildfires in North Carolina's modern history. It burned more than 200,000 acres on the Albemarle Peninsula, out in Hyde and Tyrrell counties. So again, just a huge fire that really was impossible to control because it's in a remote area of the state where you had all this forested land that was just like a tinderbox. It was ready to go up. And this happened again year after year. We saw several years with more than 100,000 acres burning across the state. In addition, after seeing a lot of these big wildfire events, there was also active fire science research going on in the 1950s and 60s. And by that time, it was actually determined that yes, there were good benefits for prescribed fire and it should be added back to the landscape. So one, we learned that a lot of our species in North Carolina were actually fairly fire tolerant or fire resistant. Things like longleaf and loblolly pines cope with fire pretty well and they can regenerate pretty quickly after a fire event. We know there are also benefits to ecosystems that fire provides. I took this picture last year. We had a workshop down at Holly Shelter Gameland at the coast. They had just done a prescribed burn there earlier in the summer, and a few months later, you were already seeing things like Venus flytraps coming back out. And one of the things I love about this picture the most is you can actually see the dead parts of the previous Venus flytraps right there, and new growth was coming up in the same spot. So again, some very fire tolerant and resistant species in North Carolina. Like farmers had known for hundreds of years, there were benefits for the soil nutrients if you did regular burning, especially of your croplands. And then finally, of course, we know what it can do for wildfire prevention. When we weren't doing any burning through the middle of the century, we were seeing these very large explosive wildfires happening across the state. So how are we managing our forests now to try to prevent and keep fires under control? Well, there are a few different practices that are pretty common right now. One of those is just doing routine prescribed burning. This is something that North Carolina is a leader in among the country. We've implemented a pretty robust certified burner training course so that folks that are going to be putting fire on the landscape are well trained in the latest fire science and know how to do that. Another practice in forest management is just regular thinning. So this has a couple benefits. One for wildfires is it keeps fires from spreading as quickly if they can't jump from tree to tree so rapidly. But also, if you prevent crowding in the forest, that has benefits as well. Again, it's letting those species in the understory get more sunlight, and it's also helping overall ecosystem health with a lot of those species that are lower down in the forest level. Adding fire breaks across the landscape has been really beneficial as well, whether that's on purpose or by accident. So one reason you don't tend to see a lot of really large wildfires in the Piedmont is because we've sort of accidentally done a great job of building so many roads and having so much development in this part of the state. So it's tough for a fire to jump across a 4-lane highway. It's not really going to be able to jump from treetop to treetop that easily. But there are other times when we're fighting an active wildfire that they'll go in with a bulldozer, for instance, and carve out a fire line, again, just to keep a fire from being able to jump across those lines and spread from tree to tree. You've heard of the saying, fight fire with fire, and that is actually a fire management strategy during a wildfire event. If there is home or property that's being threatened by a fire, a lot of times they'll light a low intensity burn on the perimeter. And if a wildfire reaches that area, all the fuels will have been burned up by then. So the wildfire really won't be able to jump any further. So that's just another form of fire break that they can use. And finally, there's this idea of firewise landscapes and firewise communities that the North Carolina Forest Service has promoted. The idea here is just getting things that burn away from your home. This could be pine straw or mulch beds or trees. And you see in the picture here, they've moved all that 6 to 10 feet away from the house. And I think one of the real tragedies of the fire events like in Gatlinburg in 2016 or in Paradise, California last year is that you look at the homes that burned up and what were they surrounded by? Exactly these things that burned, the large trees, the pine straw in the front yards. So again, it's no wonder that those areas burned up so quickly and so tragically. I should note that although we have become better adapted and know how to handle some wildfire events, there are also pressures here as well. And part of that is just because of population growth and where that growth is happening. So there's this idea of a wildland urban interface, basically where we're putting development where historically it's been natural or forested lands. This stat is hard to believe, but North Carolina has more acres of wildland urban interface than any other state in the country. And you see that especially across parts of the Southern Mountains in the Asheville area, coming up through the Piedmont and now increasingly in parts of the coastal plain. There's also evidence that suggests we're one of the fastest growing states for putting new homes in the wild and urban interface, especially in the Triangle area, the Charlotte area, parts of the mountains and parts of the southern coast. So again, when you're putting homes and development in places that historically have been forested, maybe places that have seen regular natural fire, that makes them more susceptible to have homes in the path of fires in the future. And it also means that when we want to do things like prescribed burning in these areas, they'll likely affect people. And I know Adam is planning on talking about that coming up next. This one sounds kind of counterintuitive, but the fact that we haven't had a very severe statewide drought event in more than 10 years now actually means the next time we do have a pretty bad drought, it could be even worse for fires. So this graph shows the US Drought Monitor classification since 2000. We saw that pretty severe drought in 2007 and 2008. Since then, we've had some more regional or localized drought events, but again, nothing that bad. And just think about how your backyard may look this summer. If it's anything like mine, there's lots of new green vegetation that's popped up since then. And again, if we were to have another bad drought hit, that's all stuff that can burn. So we're just building up the fuel loading, especially in some of these more undeveloped areas, for instance, in the mountains and along the coast. And on that note, when I talked to Dr. Royce a few weeks ago, I asked him what would be his main areas of concern across the state the next time we do get into a really severe drought or have a bad fire season. He said overall the Piedmont should be in decent shape again because we've done a pretty good job of carving up the landscape there and keeping very large chunks of forested land down for the most part. But for one, he pointed to the mountains. And again, we just saw this back in 2016. There are new developments that are coming in these mountain landscapes that have historically burned. And maybe they haven't burned in a long time. The US Forest Service is still catching up on a lot of that prescribed burning in these areas because they own almost 1 million acres of land in the western part of the state. But we've seen from 2016 how difficult these fires can be to contain as they move up and down terrain. The roads in these areas also don't allow firefighting equipment to get there in some cases. So you can see some runaway fires if you have the right conditions. The other part of the state he pointed to was along the coast. And again, this is where we've seen historically some of our largest wildfires, but you've got some large areas of natural forested lands that can burn even if you are doing regular prescribed burning there. The other challenge in that part of the state is a lot of those forested lands are in what we call organic or peat type soils. And in this case, the soil itself can burn. If you have a fire that's coming along near the ground and it's burning up a lot of the, say, the litter on the forest floor, eventually it can start eating into the duff and then eating into the soil itself where it's pretty rich with organic matter. There might be, decayed leaves and things in there. And if you think about throwing wet leaves on a fire in your backyard, it tends to smolder for a long time. And that's one of the challenges they have with wildfires in these areas. The picture you see here, you can notice there are exposed tree roots. And again, that's because you probably had about a foot of soil that's burned during a wildfire event here. The other challenge we see with these types of events is that they do tend to burn or smolder for months on end. They're very hard to extinguish. In a lot of cases, you can maybe try to carve a fire line or a canal to keep the fire from burning under the ground, but these fires have been known to burn underneath roads, for instance, pretty deep into the soil until they get to the water table. And also they can smolder for months on end. So the only real solution is either to let them burn or try to dump a ton of water on these just to try to put those out. And that can be very challenging, especially during a drought. And that smoke from fires can reach parts of the coast, can reach areas further inland, and can be an air quality concern in a lot of places. Going back to the climate science report and some of its findings, again, they note that future severe droughts will likely be more frequent and more intense, but also they note that those conditions in which we tend to see some of the biggest wildfires are likely to become more common in the future as well. Again, that's pretty closely linked with drought. There have been other research studies that have looked at how fire danger may change in the future, say by the end of the century. This study looked at different regions of the US. The Southeast, where we're at, is represented by the green lines here. And what they're looking at, this KBDI, is the Keach-Byram Drought Index. It's a pretty commonly used drought indicator. It doesn't necessarily show you whether fires may start, but if fires do start, how difficult will they be to manage? And what we see historically is that we do see KBDI values tend to get higher during the middle of the summer, which we expect. Things are drying out more then. But in the future, those KBDI values may be quite a bit higher. And when KBDI gets above about 400 or 450, that's a real cause for concern. That tells you that wildfires may easily get out of control above that level. And we may have several months of the year, pretty much all through the summer, above that level in the future. The other thing that stands out here is how much earlier in the year those values may begin increasing. So other studies have shown we may see a fire season in the future that's 2 or 3 months longer. It may start earlier in the year and then last longer through the summer or go later into the fall than we've had in the past. So again, there are definite risks that we're seeing just because of our climate changing. So just to wrap up with this part, again, we see historically that we have had droughts and we've had wildfires in North Carolina. So when the idea that we're having them now is nothing new. And also we've been able to adapt and find new practices that have helped us manage or mitigate these events. But at the same time, there are new pressures that are happening, things like population growth, where that population is happening. And of course, the climate pressures we're seeing as the temperatures warm, as our precipitation patterns change. Again, as we've seen, that may make future drought events more likely and more frequent and it may make wildfires going along with those events more common. So thanks everyone for your attention. I know there are some questions coming in and I'll try to take a look at those, but I appreciate you all being on this today, and I'll be happy to take questions afterwards, or if you can't get your question in and want to email it to me, that's fine as well. So Rebecca, I will stop sharing and hand it back to you.
Thank you, Corey. I always learn so much, even though I feel like, you know, we work together. I feel like I should know everything that you're talking about, but I always learn something new. So thank you. And I really liked how you talked about how interrelated things are, right? And how our land management practices can influence our vulnerability and risk to things like drought and wildfire. On the one hand, we may be doing things that reduce that risk, but they could have some, you know, environmental drawbacks or some downstream things that we have to consider. So I think we'll continue on with that vein in the next two talks. Keep those questions coming into the chat. We are kind of collecting those, and we'll moderate those once we hear from our next two speakers. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce Adam and Laurel, who will be speaking next, and then I'll hand things over to you, Adam. So Adam Turando is going to be talking about what does climate change mean for our best defense against unwanted wildfires, prescribed fire, and climate change in the Southeast US. Dr. Turando is a research ecologist with the U.S. Geological Survey Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center, which is located on the campus of NC State University. And in his work, Dr. Turando uses climate models to better understand how global warming will affect the ecosystems, habitats, and wildlife that we care about in our region. And then after him, we'll hear from Laurel Case. She will be talking about fire and climate change outreach and education. Laurel is an extension assistant in the Department of Forestry and Environmental Resources at NC State University. She earned an undergraduate degree in government and politics from the University of Maryland and a Master of Science in Forestry from NC State. And her work revolves around prescribed fire outreach, and she coordinates outreach for the Southern Fire Exchange. So with that, I will stop sharing and hand things over to you, Adam.
Great. Thanks, Rebecca. And thanks for having me, and for, thanks for everyone coming, and thanks to Corey for that tour de force presentation and sort of putting all these complex pieces together. So that was great. All right, let me get this started. Okay, so I'm just going to talk for just a couple minutes, and then we'll go over to Laurel, and so then we can have some discussion. So, what does climate change mean for fire in our region? So, again, this is just one way I look at it. Corey talked about really a lot of the different ways that we think about fire and how it impacts us. I am going to take a bit more of like a ecological perspective, which I think a lot of the folks on this call will still appreciate. But just to sort of do some place setting, so our region it's this region of a really rich landscape of biodiversity. This is showing all the different the number of species, just different counts of different species, endemic species across the U.S. And you see these red hot spots. They just, for these different groups of species, how they just keep popping up in our region in the Southeast, and particularly in the coastal plain of the Southeast. And so we really are like a biodiversity hotspot here. And a lot of those, high rates of biodiversity line up with where the historic range of the longleaf pine tree was. And so this is that historic range that extended from Southeast Virginia over to Eastern Texas, originally about 100 million acres. Now there's about 5 million acres left of longleaf pine forest. And if you're not familiar with longleaf pine forest, these are these basically open park-like stands of these pine trees where they're not only fire tolerant, but they really, to have this type of ecosystem survive and thrive and persist, you need frequent low intensity fires. So we're not talking about crown fires where you're killing the tops of the trees, but basically these low height fires that sweep through here. And historically, they were able to cover just thousands of square miles potentially at a time, because there's nothing really to stop them on these flat coastal plain landscapes. The only fire breaks you would come into contact with would be the rivers originally. And so you get these fire adapted species as well that are really sort of obligate or dependent on this particular type of habitat. So that's a lot of endangered species now, where things that are that we really only find in longleaf pine habitat or very similar types of habitat. Things like gopher tortoises, which are down in South Carolina, in Georgia, further south. But in here, North Carolina, particularly things like the red cockaded woodpecker, which is a federally listed endangered species. And so climate and topography, historically led to these high fire frequencies in our region. This is a map showing that just based on the climate and some climate factors, what you would expect the fire return interval to be. And you see that it's very high in our region. That doesn't mean, again, that it's huge conflagrations like we get out west, but it does mean we would expect pre-European settlement to have seen pretty frequent, the ability for fires to happen pretty frequently on the landscape. Nowadays, the main sort of wildfire risk we have is from some things that Corey talked about. So here is that Evans Road fire, eastern North Carolina, that crazy drought we had, and this was a peat fire, peat bog fire. So these are the ones that are smoldering fire events. They can just really burn and burn and burn for months, cause a lot of problems with air quality issues as well. And also they can really make it extremely hard for the ecosystem to bounce back after that, because you are burning down to the bare sand and the bare soil. So all that organic matter can go up in flames, which takes decades or centuries to build back up. The other type of wildfire risk that we typically encounter in North Carolina would be like what we saw just a couple of years ago out in Smoky Mountains National Park. This was a very rare fire event, but I think it kind of woke us up as to some things we need to be paying more attention to. Corey can tell you more about this. I want to say this was kind of a flash drought situation in the fall of 2016, where we had some really warm, anomalously warm fall weather. And then you combine that with some extremely high winds that just tore through these valleys. And then you had someone doing something they weren't supposed to. And then it just was a tinderbox that lit up and nearly destroyed these towns that were out there as well. So those are the two types of wildfires that we typically have concerns about now. And so extreme wildfire risk it's still a concern, especially in certain seasons, say the spring months. This is what I'm showing here. These are showing just plotting all the different fire events, in this case Georgia, but we have pretty similar type of situation here in North Carolina. So these, you see like the really big fire events, there's a couple of those that really stick out. This is January, February, March, April, May. So that spring season is when we get a lot of our biggest wildfires. And that lines up with what our seasonal wildfire pattern typically looks like. So the risk for these extreme wildfires, we expect that risk to increase in the future. So this is what's something called a probability density function. And it's showing like what's the risk of getting more extreme wildfire months in the future. So these numbers here are the number of extreme wildfire months over time. And what this shows is that for the most part, most of the climate models that we were using showed they cluster around the highest probability is not much change from today. But you have what's called a tail risk, where they're showing that the area under the curve on here, it's not zero. There is some risk that you could get 10, 20, 30 more months of over, like in this case, this was about over a 20 or 30 year period of these extreme wildfire events, which would be a huge increase in the actual risk of these low probability but high impact wildfire events. So that's one thing that we want to keep in mind. And again, this is dependent on how much more carbon we keep putting into the atmosphere. And this is if greenhouse gas emissions kept increasing at the rate we increase them now. But we have our big, secret weapon, so to speak, in the Southeast, which is prescribed fire, which we use heavily for a couple of reasons. Big one is to mitigate that wildfire risk, but also to maintain certain types of habitat, because we do value these forests that are really fire dependent. And this has just been an amazing success story in terms of rediscovering, the value of a prescribed fire. Of course, like Corey said, it's, and I think Laurel said, and we'll say again that, this is a history that really goes back thousands of years in our region. So this is showing from I think Fort Stewart down in Georgia, showing here's the number of wildfires over time, going back to the early 80s. And you can see how those numbers just dropped as they instituted a prescribed fire management program. As they started burning more acres on purpose, the number of fires that were burning on accident or unwanted fires dropped dramatically. But fire management is sensitive to climate variability and climate change. So this is showing the number of permits issued for prescribed fires, but that you can see that the actual acres burned decreased dramatically in 2017 because the conditions just weren't right. It was too hot, too dry. So we wanted to examine this, and in terms of prescribed burning, how climate change could affect our ability to maintain a certain prescribed fire regime. So we looked at some simple meteorological criteria that are used by fire managers to determine when is it safe to burn. So we just looked at temperature, relative humidity, and wind speeds, all really important conditions. Temperature, in one sense, is also really important because if it gets way too hot, the main consideration there is that just the personnel shouldn't be out there burning. So the question we asked was, how could projected changes in climate affect prescribed burning opportunities in the Southeast? And we were looking at specifically what's the suitable number of days per month to conduct a prescribed burn. So again, these were the variables we used. And if you want any more details on this, we published this recently in this international journal, Wildland Fire. So just to cut to the chase, since it's just a couple of minutes, what we found is that if looking at the region, the entire Southeast, so here's Florida, Gulf of Mexico, Texas, we broke this up into sort of different clumps of months and seasons. So winter is on the left, the transition season in the spring is in the middle, and then the summer. And if you look at the suitable number, the percentage of suitable days, that's what's showing here. So if it's red, that means you don't have any days that are what we say are within prescription. And green means all the days are within prescription. So if the conditions are right for you, you can go out and burn. Historically, summer was not a great season to burn, but it could still work. And the transition season basically was a good time to burn no matter what. At least the criteria we picked, you weren't going to be out of prescription for the most part. On average, you would not be out of prescription. When we look into the future, here's again, this is a lower emission scenario in this middle row, and here's the higher emission scenario in the lower row. This is looking out at the end of the century. And you see that summer basically goes away as an option, particularly in the higher emissions, greenhouse gas emissions scenario. The transition seasons get tricky, where some areas you still have decent times to burn, but in other areas it starts to really go away as being an option, or it just becomes a riskier time of year to attempt to burn. I'm going to go ahead and skip these in interest of time and just go to the last part right here. So this is just showing the time series, and this is looking at the Uwharrie National Forest, so in North Carolina. So again, we have 3 seasons, okay? The red line is showing the percentage of suitable burn days for this season over time. So that's what we observed. And then the shading here is the results from all the climate models. And then the dotted line is what we call the multi-model mean, or just averaging all the different climate models. So you can see under the higher emission scenario that in winter and the transition time for the Uwharries, where the models project about roughly the same amount of opportunities, although in the transition seasons, we say the variance is really increasing. The range of outcomes across all the climate models expands, particularly by the end of the century. So again, that just shows we have a lot more uncertainty about what the future could hold in that transition season. If you look at the summer, though, under the higher emission scenario, it's pretty clear that we're projecting that trying to perform prescribed burns in the summer would become a really tough proposition as you go forward in time if we kept going on this higher emission scenario. If you go on the lower emission scenario, it decreases, it becomes a riskier proposition, but still a possibility, really. It still could be something that is not out of the question. So here's the results here. Basically, we would think that the prescribed fire season is probably going to have to shift to the cooler months to keep up with a warming climate. Those opportunities are projected to drop by up to 50% under the lower emission scenario, but that goes up to 85% fewer burning opportunities under the higher emission scenario. And so again, we're sort of looking at those cooler season months as being sort of forced into that as an adaptation strategy as the climate warms. And that's all I had, and we'll take questions here in a minute.
Thanks, Adam. That was really fascinating. Yeah, I've seen some questions come in, so we'll definitely get to them. So next we'll go to Laurel. And it's up. You are on mute.
All right, are you seeing my screen all right?
Yes.
Okay, great. So yeah, thanks guys. My name is Laurel Kays. I work out of NC State Extension Forestry, and I do fire-related outreach of a lot of different varieties. And I wanted to talk a little bit about resources that are out there for you as extension professionals or other folks to learn more and get more information and connect with other people as new issues related to fire and climate change may come up, because we understand we can't cover every single thing on an hour-and-a-half webinar. So I'm going to talk a little bit about first some resources that are out there for you in terms of more education as a professional or an important person in your community who is communicating about these things. And then I'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like to translate to your constituency and the public, some ways to do that, and then I'll wrap up. So first and foremost, the folks on this call are great resources. If you have any questions at all, NC State Extension Forestry, myself, and my colleague who's currently out on leave, but will be back in the next couple of months, Jennifer Fawcett, are both full-time fire outreach people. So if you have questions, if you have a program need, if you have a question from a constituent that you can't answer, feel free to reach out to us. And if we don't know the answer, we can certainly get it for you. I'll also say that we do semi-regular trainings on this topic. We usually do an agent training every year. Fire is often a topic that we talk about in that, and it definitely will be a topic if it's something that is requested. We also try and do a session at the NC State Extension Conference every year. I know the Climate Office tends to do that as well. So those are just some places that we tend to be already doing trainings, but we're happy to do more programming with you if there's a way we can be helpful. And of course, the Climate Office is also a great resource. I think I mentioned in the chat box, but the Southern Fire Exchange and the Fire Science Exchange networks as a group are also a great place to get more information. This is a national network of entities that are federally funded, and our job, and I work for the Southern Fire Exchange as part of my duties, and our job is to make sure that the research that's being done by great folks like Adam is being translated to you folks who are working on the ground in an understandable way. And to also make sure that the research that's being done is answering questions that folks on the ground really need answered. So we have a lot of great resources. I have some screen grabs and I can send the links out, or I think Rebecca is going to send the links out after this webinar. But I'll just mention a couple. We did a webinar a couple months ago with Rebecca about what the North Carolina Climate Science Report means for wildland fire. I linked in the chat, I believe, we have a bi-monthly newsletter, which each month has a research brief, which is just a summary, plain language summary of a recent important paper. And that did feature the paper that Adam was talking about in our last newsletter. So that's available. We have fact sheets on a number of different topics, and we're just finishing up one that I'm co-writing with Rebecca and a gentleman out of Florida about climate change and wildland fire. So that should be coming out soon. So that's a resource for you. But we do a variety of webinars and trainings trying to translate what the science is saying in a way that is understandable for folks who need to speak plain English. The Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center is also a great resource. Like their name says, their whole point of existing is to help folks adapt to climate change. So they have a lot of great resources. I spoke at a panel they had, I guess it was earlier this year, talking about fire and connecting science, management policy. A recording of that is up on their site, but they have a lot of other great resources as well. And a lot of their resources too tend to tie into some of these other things folks have mentioned in the chat, like water management, agriculture, some of these things that are related to wildland fire, but may be more tangential. I'd also encourage you, kind of like Corey was talking about, and Adam as well, when you talk about fire and climate change, it's related to so many other things in the South because the bulk of our wildland fire management is based around our ability to do prescribed fire. And so that is so interrelated with development patterns and how we're building out into areas that were previously entirely wild. It has to do with how we're building structures and whether they are built with fire adaptation in mind. It has to do with sea level rise and how that's impacting fire behavior and regeneration after fires. It has to do with budgets and capacity and our ability to actually go out and pay people to burn. So these are all issues that you may not be able to keep totally plugged in with. I know a lot of us have too many things to do already, but just some things to keep in mind that it might be worth keeping up with. So what does that look like in terms of communicating with your constituency or with the public? Just some sort of guiding questions to keep in mind. None of this, I think, will be rocket science, especially for any of you who are in extension. First and foremost, what issues are they facing related to fire? What is going to impact them? Are they concerned about smoke and health impacts? Are they about livestock? Are they concerned about potentially having to evacuate? Are they concerned about fire-resistant landscaping? There are a lot of issues related to fire that folks could be interested in. It's worth knowing the basics, and that mostly means the things that Corey and Adam covered on this webinar, which is kind of our history with fire here in this region, how that might differ from other places that are often in the news, and our widespread use and the importance of prescribed fire for our ecosystems. But beyond that, please do pull in those of us who are fire professionals. We know you can't answer every question. And again, myself and Jen are entirely outreach focused surrounding fire. And there's an awful lot of other folks in the state, and I'll talk about some of them in the very last slide, that are out there able and willing to help you out to do this programming. And also I'll just add, I think Adam kind of alluded to this, a lot of these projections related to all topics surrounding climate change are talking about adaptation. And adaptation is super important, but I think it is also worth raising in the rooms that you're in what it looks like. Are we talking about mitigation at all? What resources or policies do your constituents need to stay safe, to be employed, related to climate change? To talk about some of these bigger questions, because I think we do need to talk about that more in fire and at a larger level. But in terms of what programming looks like functionally related to fire, all of your typical outreach programs are absolutely worth doing, pulling in folks to do talks, doing field days, workshops, all of those sort of things. But I'll mention some specific fire-specific programming that's really catching on around the South. And I'll also plug a guide that Jennifer Fawcett and I wrote about specifically wild and fire programming for extension and outreach professionals. Rebecca can send that link out at the end of this webinar. It has some just planning considerations, things to think about for those folks who may not be fire primary people, but want to do some of this programming. Learn and burn workshops are a really great resource. These are just largely centered around getting more people involved in prescribed fire, getting more burning done on the ground. These are workshops that actually get landowners out in the field under the mentorship of a trained professional and actually teach them how to conduct prescribed fires so they can go back and do it on their property. Fire festivals and education days have become really popular, particularly with state parks here in North Carolina. And have been done all the way from the Western Mountains all the way to the coast. And these are just really fun, family-friendly events with booths and animals that folks can hold, but they're fire themed and aimed at teaching people about the importance of fire management, the importance of prescribed fire. They often include demonstration prescribed fires so that you can get the public on board with the fact that these are actually really safe, thought out, planned events. They aren't the big, scary wildfires they often see in the news. And photos and good media coverage are always important. It's worth thinking about the fact, particularly if you're in a capacity where you're getting questions about fire, that tends to be cyclical. It's going to happen every summer, fall, when fires are in the news out west. And people start asking questions about how that relates to us here in North Carolina. And so just being ready with some of those basics to answer some of those questions is definitely worthwhile. And again, here are just some partners to think about, but you can always get in contact with me or with Rebecca or Corey or Adam. And I'm sure we would all be happy to direct you to someone who can help you with whatever specific issue you're facing. The North Carolina Forest Service is a great first call. They have folks in every county in the state, and they are our primary wildfire responder, their primary entity that helps out with assisting people conducting prescribed fires. If you're a landowner who wants to conduct a prescribed fire, they're a great resource. North Carolina Parks, again, I mentioned them in terms of outreach and education. If you're near a U.S. Forest Service or Fish and Wildlife outlet, they're great partners. The Nature Conservancy and the Longleaf Alliance and other nonprofits are also really active. And I'll also mention for those in the western part of the state, about kind of Morganton and to the west, that the Resource Conservation and Development Councils are a network of nonprofits out that way that's been really active, particularly in outreach to people about fire-resistant landscaping and fire-wise communities. They're a great resource as well for some of the stuff that's more on the kind of fire response, wildfire adaptation end of things. And so if you live in that area, they're great partners to reach out to. But yeah, get in touch. I'll stop sharing and we can go on to questions, but I think big takeaway is just if you want to do programming about this, you absolutely can. And there's a lot of great resources that are out there to help you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I really appreciated the tips for how we can communicate. Thought that was really helpful. So typically we take a short break. I think we'll just keep it to about a minute in case anyone needs to go run and get some water or something. Or if you don't need to take a break, please feel free to type some questions into the chat and we'll get to them. So I'll just mute myself and we'll come back at 2:15. So I have 2:15. So we'll jump into the questions here. Again, if you have a question, please feel free to type it into the chat. Even if we cannot get to it during the webinar, we try to synthesize the notes and include them in the follow-up materials. So looking at some of the questions that have come in. So one of the ones that came in was asking about El Nino and La Nina and how they can impact precipitation. And I think this question was maybe directed to you, Corey. So do the droughts in the 1920s, that 2007 to 2009 drought and the one in 2019, how did those correspond with El Nino or La Nina, if you have anything about that?
Yeah, the short answer is that especially in a lot of our really long-lived and multi-year droughts, definitely being in a La Nina type pattern during the wintertime can make those worse, can make those last longer. The long answer, just to give a little bit more background, is that we talk about El Nino or La Nina based on what the sea surface temperatures in the Pacific look like. If they're a little bit warmer than normal, we call that El Nino. And that if it's cooler than normal, La Nina. Based on what pattern we're in, that can change the way the jet streams set up, especially during the cool season, during the fall and the winter. When we're in a La Nina phase, the jet streams are typically to the north. So we're getting warmer air, drier air from the south. We're not seeing as many weather systems. So La Nina winters in North Carolina tend to be drier. So the 2007-8 drought was a great example. we were coming out of a pretty hot, dry year. We went into a La Nina winter where it stayed dry. So that drought lasted through the next winter, well on into the spring and summer, even though we would usually see good rainfall recharge during the wintertime. 2011 is another good example. It had already been pretty dry coming into 2011, but that was another La Nina winter, pretty warm and dry. By the time we got to the spring, everything, especially across the coast, was just ready to burst into flames. So that's why we had some big fires there. I think another part of the question was about flash droughts and how those can be related. The answer, especially like the flash drought last year, is it probably didn't really have any effect because that happened during our warm season or the summertime. We just don't really see a lot of impacts from El Nino or La Nina during the summer in North Carolina. That event was just more of a consequence of how that large scale high pressure system set up for a month or two and got us into a pretty bad drought pretty quickly.
Thank you. Yeah, and we'll include some links to more resources about El Nino and La Nina in the follow-up notes. So in the chat, there were a couple of really interesting kind of questions and comments that came in thinking about environmental trade-offs. So this idea that you might build a reservoir, which might make you more resilient to drought by having a longer lasting water supply, but there could also be some environmental impacts, or in terms of fire breaks, carving up the landscape that could be good to prevent wildfires from jumping, but also bad maybe for ecosystem management. So I'm just wondering if any of the speakers could comment on, how does that factor into, especially when we're thinking about projections for the future, and maybe Adam, this might be a question for you. If we're thinking about there's going to be climate variables that change in terms of like temperature and precipitation, but how does that land use, management kind of play into thinking about that?
Sure. Well, it definitely affects the decision making, and it can either be a help or a hindrance to any sort of adaptation actions we want to take. So for prescribed fire, particularly if one of the main objectives is a lot of prescribed fire, again in North Carolina, is not only done to reduce wildfire risk, but to specifically maintain a type of habitat, like longleaf pine habitat. You think about Fort Bragg, they're doing both, and so having a lot more development around Fort Bragg, particularly, sort of what we call urban sprawl or low density residential development, it can make it really tricky to still maintain the same amount of flexibility that you would have, because now you have to consider air quality impacts of, and those become, the closer you are to where people are living, the more constrained you are in your decision making to be able to use prescribed fire whenever you want. So it's not only then, say, well, it's not too hot, it's not too dry, it's not too windy, but it's also, well, is the wind from the right direction, and so is there enough, is the air, how much dispersion is there in the air right now? Is the smoke going to go up and away there in the way I want it to, or is it going to hang around and hover over this residential development? So it's a factor. The land use patterns are a big factor in how we are able to use prescribed fire in the future.
I'll also add just super quick on the sort of natural resilience, and I'm sorry for my dog in the background, but on the kind of natural resiliency end, at least in longleaf country, longleaf tends to be more resilient to things like insects, wind damage from hurricanes than a lot of other species that are found there as a result of fire exclusion. I don't know to what extent that there is a corollary to that in mountainous ecosystems, but definitely a lot of these species that are fire adapted and that are sort of more natural as the dominant species are more resilient to some of these hazards.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, it's seems like in many ways it's just getting more complicated. It's not getting less complex as we think about it. So one of the questions that came in during a pre-webinar survey we sent out had to do with communications and specifically thinking about, you know, we have some sort of like transitory populations in North Carolina, like I think tourists in the eastern part of the state or in the fall during leaf peeper season going to the mountains. Are there programs to elevate the general public's awareness of like wildfire potential in the different parts of the regions of the state, particularly if they're not familiar with what the climate is or what that wildfire potential is?
So I'll take a first stab at that. Yes, but with an asterisk. There are definitely, so some of those things like fire festivals and education days have definitely take place across the state, specifically to that point, to try and build support for good fire management, whatever that looks like locally, and to educate the public about why that's important. There also are some efforts, kind of what you were talking about, to reach out to some of these constituency groups like realtors or the insurance industry and try and use them as a communication pathway. There are a lot of issues with that. So I used to work on wildfire mitigation out in the mountains. First and foremost, capacity. All of us who work in fire are underpaid and overworked, just like many other people on this call. And so that does make it difficult to reach out to some of these groups that are more transitory. There definitely is some hesitancy from some of these groups, particularly thinking about like realtors, or the tourism industry, to talk about things that are bad or perceived as bad, or at least hazardous, like fire. But there definitely are efforts to reach out to these folks, people, once they actually move somewhere. When people do prescribe fires, they do let people know. If you're in the area, folks who are burning, whether they're federal, state agency, nonprofit, TNC, whatever, who try their very best to let people know through as many avenues as possible. So from that perspective, people hopefully aren't taken by surprise, particularly people who may be more sensitive and at risk. But yeah, there are some barriers to trying to reach out to some of those folks who are like second homeowners and those kind of people.
I'll just add my perspective as well. So I've been on both sides of that. I've been, the one doing research and monitoring for fire, and I've also been the tourist that goes to the Outer Banks, and then I get smoked in a couple days because one of the big coastal wildfires, decides to blow in my way. So I guess the way I see it, there's a couple ways you could do this. One would be just a call to action. So if it is a bad drought where you have, the potential for big fires, how can you tell people going that way, that's going on? Is it just putting up a sign on the side of the road that says, don't flick your cigarettes in this forest because you may start a 100,000 acre fire? Or, I say this only half in jest, do we need like a Smokey the Bear type figure for the big coastal organic fires that, tells you what the danger level is that day? And the other piece I see is just the awareness part. And Laurel kind of got at this. I think this is trickier because no town at the coast will want to advertise, hey, if you come here in June, you may get a face full of smoke. So yeah, how do we set up, this education for people that may be coming to that part of the state without discouraging them from going there? So, maybe it's like going to the visitor center on Roanoke Island where they've got, the Lost Colony exhibit now, and putting educational signs or something up about North Carolina's climate and, wildfire regimes. So I don't know if that would work, but just an idea again for that awareness part.
And I'll add to add an extra layer of complexity. It's hard to talk about wildfires, and even Corey and I have both done it, talk about them as a negative. And from a human perspective, that can be very true. It's never good when someone loses their house or has health impacts. Like, that is objectively bad. But from an ecological perspective, they are not necessarily bad. And so also trying to figure out how to walk that line of like, we want you to be safe, but also these are a natural part of our communities. And, the story is a little more complicated there.
And then I'll just add that first to Barbara, yes, and there are lots of educational materials about fire in state parks, I think. And so I was going to say along those lines in terms of education, at least in terms of North Carolina, I think that's why it's important for making environmental education a core part of the curriculum for students in school. And I think kids should know about where they come from and where they live and what the environmental history of their state is, just as much as the the human history. And of course, those things are intertwined. But and so I think having that fire literacy, I think that's something we should strive for in education in this state. And of course, extension can play a really big role in that, both in formal education, but also informal and things like 4-H programs, things like that.
Yeah, and I'm really glad that you brought up environmental education. I started to get my certificate in it because it's just so cool. And I think that it would be really valuable to really promote that more. Sorry, Laurel, you're gonna.
I was just gonna say, we are in the process of adapting this thing called the fireworks curriculum, which is a comprehensive, it's for teachers, but very adaptable to sort of informal educators for adults and kids. And we use a lot of the activities there in our outreach already. But we're in the process of adapting that curriculum for the South. So hopefully in the next couple of years, we will have some better tools for exactly what Adam is talking about.
That is awesome. So we have 2 minutes left. So I was going to ask kind of one sort of a big overarching question for each of the panelists is, where do you see kind of the research questions going in the next, 5 to 10 years? What are the things that we're going to try to tackle our understanding of in relation to droughts and wildfires and how climate change is influencing those?
Well, I can go. For me, I think where we're taking it next is we want to build this into basically things managers can directly use. And so if they're trying to maintain a burn regime or prescribed fire program, and they want to know, well, how is climate change going to affect my ability to keep doing this? We want to be able to incorporate near-term weather forecasting information with long-term climate prediction or climate projections, and so they can sort of assess those trade-offs in real time, like and get a sense of like how risky is it now to burn now versus put it off for a year versus put it off for 5 years, and what would that mean for 30 years. And so how does that affect like sort of the short-term, long-term decision making and short-term versus long-term management objectives? That's where we're trying to take it. And so I'm really excited to work on that. That's sort of it'll be a tough but really interesting problem to work on.
I'll say that one bit of research that's actually ongoing at our office, the State Climate Office, is looking at these organic soils and how and when they might burn. Again, I mentioned how they can be kind of unusual, in the fact that they can burn and smolder for months, which you really don't see in a normal, more mineral type soil. So our office has deployed some monitoring stations at a few sites in organic soils across the coast, just to measure soil, things like soil moisture. And we're going to actually start doing an analysis in the next year or so, just trying to see if we can create, sort of like Adam just talked about, some guidance for land managers to say, hey, maybe if you've only seen this much rainfall lately, that's a sign your organic soils may start to burn. Just try to find any sort of indicator in these areas that can help if a fire is going to start, that they can be on top of it, or to give them some guidance about whether these soils are ready to burn or smolder.
Yeah, I'm super excited about that project that Corey, and the one that Adam actually just mentioned as well. And I'll just, I guess, speak less to specific research we need and more to the fact that we need to be more actionable on the research that we have, in terms of, we have a lot of research on how to burn, when to burn, how to get landowners and other people more involved in burning. And we need to be more actionable about that. And a lot of that is complicated in terms of changing policies and getting budgets to the point where people are willing to commit resources towards these things. But I think, research is super important and we're learning more every day, and that's great, and we need to continue that. And also we need to use the research that we have to make things better.
Yeah, I think that was a really great, well, it's really exciting to see where all the research is going. But then, yeah, also thinking about, it seems like it's all going in this direction of understanding more about the system, but then also how do we then turn that into something that can really be actionable for some end user. So that's all the questions we have time for. I did, before folks, drop off the webinar, any attendees, if you have, we're always looking for feedback. And so if you have any feedback, or, if there's something that you learned that was like really wow, that you want to share with us, feel free to type something in the chat to that effect. And then I'll just sort of share our next 2 webinars in the series. The last 2 will be taking place in December, so about a month from now. We'll have one on sea level rise, and then the final one will be on talking about climate change. All of these webinars are being recorded. You'll get that registration link in the follow-up email that I send out. Yes, and all these slides and the contact information for speakers, I'll make sure that is included as well, so you have it. And all the resources that Laurel's been linking to will definitely be including. So with that, I'll end it there. Thank you again so much, Corey, Adam, and Laurel. I really appreciate you speaking today. I learned so much, and I appreciate you sticking on just a couple minutes late too. So I will stick around in case anyone has any questions for me, but we'll end it there.
Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Yeah, thank you.
I think I got all the last answers captured there, more or less.
So, yeah, so I'll go through the notes and share them. I know Laurel's going to send me quite a few things. So,
okay. Yeah, if they can take a look, if they have anything to clean up or whatever.
Yeah.
But, that was really good. I learned a ton of things.
Yeah.
Lots of resources. That's
yeah.
It's cool. It's like, the more we can say, and here's some things you can do with it. So.
Yeah.
Cool.
But like I know a lot about drought and wildfires, but I still learned so much. So
yeah.
All right. Well, I think we'll end it there, and I'll talk to you over email soon. Yeah.
All right. Take care. Good job. Thanks very much.